What a field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street singing songs and they carry inside. Mostly saying hooray for our side. These battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. When people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children, what's that sound? Everybody look, it's going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner with the Robust Opposition, and I'm here with my special guest, Kevin Zeese, to talk about the real Ukrainian scandal that the mainstream corporate media will not cover. Because we're seeing a lot of stuff about the Ukraine and how it is going to be the thing to get Trump impeached, but there's really a greater story. I'd like to welcome Kevin Zeese, who has been on my show before. He's an organizer and an activist with popularresistance.org. And he just put out a fantastic newsletter yesterday. Ukraine Gate teaches us more about ourselves than Trump or Biden. How you doing, Kevin?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thanks for being on. I was really impressed with this newsletter. It's extremely comprehensive. And right away, I knew what you were talking about because back in 2015, I read the article in Consortium News by the late, great Robert Parry, the investigative journalist, who basically uncovered the Iran-Contra-Gate story in the 80s. This article was called The Mess Nuland Made. And Victoria Nuland was the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs in Hillary Clinton's State Department. And I used that article to show how Russiagate was BS. And one of the elements of Russiagate was how Russia destabilized the Ukraine when it was really the United States. So why don't you tell us who was Victoria Nuland and what exactly did she do in the Ukraine back during the Obama administration?
Great question. And you make a great point about corporate media describes how Russia destabilized Ukraine, when in fact what Ukraine went through back in 2014, beginning in December and then into the early part of 2014, was a very outrageous coup by the United States. I mean, it was the most open coup in U.S. history until the current Venezuela coup that President Trump is still trying to put forward. It was an open coup in part because of Victoria Nuland. She did a couple of things that really stand out. One was in December, she gave a speech to a business group, a Ukrainian business group, about how the U.S. had spent $5 billion over 5 years in order to bring Ukraine into the European and U.S. orbit, to get them to break from Russia and come in to the EU and be allied with the United States. The president at that time was allied with Russia, and he rejected an EU offer to ally with the European nations, and instead decided to stay independent with Russian allied nations. And that $5 billion figure is a massive amount of money. What it was used for was to build an opposition to the government. The government had been in power for 2 years of a 4-year term. They were elected democratically. And when the president refused to join with the EU, that really spurred the movement for a US-sponsored coup. So that's one thing she did. And that was in December, that call. The coup actually happened in February. It was completed in February. It was already starting in December. And another thing she did was in January, she made the mistake, or I don't know if it was intentional, but it was certainly stupid, of being on an open telephone call. One that she had with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, in which they talked about what kind of government will the United States want to see after the coup occurs. This is still a month before the coup. And they figured that the person they want as the prime minister was Yats. Yats is a longtime politician in Ukraine. He's an economist, former foreign minister, foreign finance minister, and he was the guy that she picked, Yats. And in the end, Yats did become the prime minister. And so her prediction or her appointment became true in the post-coup government. He was the first prime minister. Now, Yats is a right-wing guy from Western Ukraine who does not believe the Holocaust happened. When he was prime minister, he traveled to Germany, and they couldn't believe the things he was saying, that there was no Holocaust. And so he actually served as prime minister for 2 years in the post-coup government. Then he created a new party that represented the neo-Nazis, the Western part of Ukraine. And he had a good, successful first round of elections, but the second round they didn't, and he left the government. So that was one thing those are two things that Nuland did, was she exposed the $5 billion funding of the opposition movement and picking the next prime minister on an open phone line that was overheard and taped.
Victoria Nuland was married to Robert Kagan, who is a neocon who co-founded the Project for a New American Century in 1998 around a demand for regime change in Iraq. And obviously the same problems that happened, because they don't understand the country, they don't understand the dynamics, the different groups. And like you mentioned, this group was supported by, Yat was supported by neo-Nazi militias and Islamic jihadists. And that was also, they tried to cover that up. Now, when he got installed, apparently the US demanded this neoliberal economic plan, slashing pensions, heating assistance, and other social programs. Parry said that her regime change unleashed and transformed Ukraine into a financial black hole. So ever since then, that country has been trying to shed light on what we did and trying to get us out of there, basically. And these investigations, John Solomon, who we will not be talking about tonight because I want to do a little bit more research into him. He is a conservative reporter for the publication The Hill, and he's got a lot of information on Biden and Giuliani and everything. And apparently he's, talking to Trump and Hannity, and just by virtue of that, the Daily Beast wrote an article smearing John Solomon. But I'm not inclined to necessarily believe anything the Daily Beast says, because they're, corporate mainstream media.
Tied to the Clintons.
Talk about what you know about what's been happening in the Ukraine since we unleashed this regime change.
So we've been covering Ukraine at Popular Resistance since December 2013. If you go to popularresistance.org/tag/Ukraine after our URL, you'll see 11 pages with each page listing 15 articles about Ukraine going back to December 2013. So we've been covering it in real time. The president, according to WikiLeaks documents, WikiLeaks has released a whole series of documents that Poroshenko is involved in, and they show that Poroshenko was an informant for the CIA for 6 years before becoming president. And they show documents where U.S. officials told him how we know he's corrupt, but it's a price we have to pay. And they also have a document where Poroshenko is telling Clinton how important it is for the U.S. to be in Crimea. Crimea is very important because it still is a long-term, multi-hundred-year Navy base for Russia, and it is Russia's a port to the sea, freshwater sea, and in the end, Crimea voted to return to Russia rather than becoming part of the post-Kiev government. And the reason that's true is why they did that was because when the government came into power, they were very neo-Nazi, very anti-Russia. They were talking about passing laws making Russian language illegal. And so people in Crimea and East Ukraine really did not want to be part of that. But
can I just stop you on Crimea? Because this was a big story that was sold to the American people.
yes.
That Russia illegally invaded and annexed Crimea. And that was why we now all of a sudden had to be enemies with them, correct?
Well, yes, that was it's a really interesting story. I mean, it's an invasion where they already had a Navy base, a long-term lease for it. So they already had military forces in Crimea. There were no shots fired. There was an election where people in Crimea voted to return to Russia, but it has been characterized in U.S. media as Russia taking over Crimea. In fact, Ukraine was part of Russia for a almost all of its history, hundreds of years. It was Khrushchev, who was born in Ukraine, who gave Ukraine its independence when it was part of the Soviet, made a separate nation in the Soviet Union. So the ties between Russia and Ukraine are long and deep, and in Crimea and East Ukraine, these are primarily Russian-speaking areas. Let me get back, though, to OU, our Ukraine insider. That's what the CIA called Petro Poroshenko, OU, our Ukraine insider. He was an oligarch, candy business, and known as corrupt. And under Poroshenko and throughout this century, Ukraine has shrunk in size, 25% shrinkage of its GDP from early 2000s to current days. 25%. That's a quarter of its GDP has disappeared. So people are feeling impoverished for good reason. And there has been widespread corruption. There was widespread corruption before Poroshenko, and there's been widespread corruption after Poroshenko. And Poroshenko remained in office until recently, when Zelensky won an election in the spring with a 73% vote in his favor, so a landslide election. And then this summer, Zelensky called for an election of the parliament, and they had an election in July, and his party won the parliament as well. So Zelensky has basically wiped out the past government, and now he's in power, and he's the one who Trump had that infamous phone call with that we'll talk about a little bit later. So Poroshenko comes in. Now, Poroshenko was not the final U.S. figure to come in. The finance minister for Ukraine was a woman who, she's an interesting story. She was a woman who's a longtime State Department employee. She came to Ukraine.
This is Natalia Jaresko.
Natalia Jaresko. She came to Ukraine after the Orange Revolution, another U.S. coup attempt, and she set up shop there as a hedge fund manager. That hedge fund was used to manage all those billions of dollars that we mentioned earlier, the $5 billion. A lot of that went through her hedge fund into Ukraine. And she was getting paid $150,000 a year for that, and got a $1.7 million bonus on top of her annual salary for managing that fund that created the opposition in the Ukraine. Now, what's interesting about her is she became finance minister. Now, to be finance minister, you have to be a citizen of Ukraine. So what did OU do? What did our Ukraine insider do? On the day that she became foreign minister, he made her a citizen. So she could be finance minister. So that means the U.S. has the prime minister, it has the president, and it has the foreign minister. And that's what I mean. This is one of the most open U.S. coups in history.
And the irony, I have to stop you here, because the irony is we have been, talking about the Russians interfering in our election for almost 3 years now, when we did what we're talking about right now in the Ukraine. And then, of course, I keep reminding people what we did with Yeltsin's election.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. As you said that, I was just thinking that. Exactly.
I mean, we actually sent advisors over to run his freaking campaign.
That's
and
right.
I pointed this out to Ted Lieu at his town hall in the spring of 2017.
Right.
And at first, when I introduced myself and said I was a Bernie delegate, everybody applauded. But the more I got into this business about how we needed to get rid of Trump, but we needed to get rid of him on the emoluments clause, not this Russiagate BS. And I started to bring up what we did with Yeltsin. All of a sudden, the audience turned on me and they started booing me and heckling me. It was hysterical.
Well, Yeltsin was the post-Soviet leader of Russia, and he is one who put in place this capitalist kleptocracy.
And he put in Putin. Putin was his number two guy.
Putin, that's right. He brought in Putin. So anyway, the U.S. made that bed, and now we're sleeping in it. So anyway, you have the prime minister, the president, the foreign minister, all control the United States. What do? They pass a law on agriculture. Agriculture is very important in Ukraine. Ukraine has fantastic agriculture, very pristine. They pass a law, two things. One, they allow private corporations from out of the country to own property. That was a new change. That wasn't allowed. And second thing they did was a $8 billion loan from IMF was given to Ukraine, but they had to allow these GMO products and GMO products in their agriculture. So this pristine environment is Monsanto'd by the United States and totally transformed from pristine to polluted. And the other thing that happened, that is the current controversy, is of course the Ukraine gas company. And two people were appointed to that board who should not have been appointed because of their political connection. It was totally inappropriate. Joe Biden's son, Hunter, was appointed to the board, even though he has no oil and gas experience. A month before getting appointed, he had just been kicked out of the Navy Reserve because of a cocaine positive test. Hunter is a very sad character, had a tough life, and I feel sorry for him. The other person that was appointed was Devin Archer, who was a financial advisor to John Kerry. He ran John Kerry's finances for his campaign. He also manages the Heinz family, which is John Kerry's family's finances. He was the roommate of John Kerry's stepson in college, and he was appointed to the board. So you had Devin Archer and Hunter Biden appointed the board. They had been business partners in a firm called Rosemont with Chris Heinz, the stepson, and Rosemont became the place where hundreds of thousands of dollars were funneled every month into that firm from Ukraine. And so millions of dollars over the several years that they were on the board was put into their pockets. And that really kind of results in controversy that we're dealing with now with the impeachment. And what really brings that controversy on is the whole issue of Joe Biden publicly saying at a Council of Foreign Relations meeting on video that he was in Ukraine, and he told the president that they're not going to get their $1 billion IMF loan unless the prosecutor general is fired. And he has to be fired before I leave town, he said. Biden was there for 6 hours, so he had to be fired within 6 hours, and then they would get their sign off on their $1 billion loan. And Biden proudly, smirkingly says to the Council on Foreign Relations, and lo and behold, he was fired. Well, the story from the Ukrainians is that that was not just a 6-hour event. It was going on for months before that. There was pressure from the Washington, D.C., and Joe Biden was the point man for President Obama on Ukraine.
And they were investigating this on their own, right? This was something that was of concern to them. Ukraine.
Who was? Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine. The prosecutor general was investigating the gas company that Hunter Biden was on the board of. Now, you're getting a lot of rewriting of history in the current times because Joe Biden is running for president, and Joe Biden has been a politician since the early 70s. For 40 plus years, he's been a senator or a vice president or a presidential candidate. So he has incredible connections in politics, both parties, because he's a bipartisan guy. He's proudly works with Strom Thurmond, and he has very strong connections in the DNC and in the media. Because when you do politics like at that level, U.S. senator for a full state, vice president, presidential candidate, you have lots of media connections. And so he has lots of people who, when Biden makes an effort to change the narrative, he can really push a lot of buttons. And there's a story in Politico about how Biden is making a big effort to change the narrative to make sure Hunter Biden is not discussed as part of this Ukraine gate. He does not want Ukraine gate to become Biden gate. Mm-hmm. It has that serious risk for Joe Biden. If it does become Biden gate, it becomes an existential threat to his political career. I mean, as people look at this coup, this very open Obama-Biden-Clinton coup, and look at Joe Biden's role, just the fact that that his son got a job in the largest private gas company, reports say $50,000 a month. Other documents show even higher numbers of going into Rosemont. Just the fact that the son got that job with no oil and gas experience and minimal business experience is itself a problem.
Well, this is what we have with political families. We have this nepotism. Look, Chelsea Clinton got a very high-paying job with CNN, I think it was. Yeah. She had no background in journalism. I mean, this happens all the time. To me, this is not the real scandal. So let's
let me say that what's important about that. This is the way payoffs are made. Rather than the payoff going to the senator himself or the vice president himself, put the family member on board. This happens all the time. Family members put on boards, get paid $50,000 a month or $100,000 a year, whatever, depending on the size of the corporation. This is a great way to pay off politicians, and there's nothing illegal about it.
Right, and it's the same thing with the Clinton Foundation. I mean, all these governments paid money to the Clinton Foundation, and then they got favors in return. Now, this has become so partisan that if anybody like Fox News or Sean Hannity start investigating it, like they're investigating Joe Biden's son, all of a sudden it becomes discredited. And you have the Daily Beast, writing these articles discrediting Joe Solomon. From what I can read from his articles, he has the source material. I mean, everything that he writes is completely transparent, as he loves to say, and totally linked back to the original material.
To documents, exactly. Yeah. That's what's so important about it. And that's really, and really is a challenge in our media environment to understand what's going on, whether it's Hong Kong, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Syria, or Ukraine.
You mentioned Hong Kong, and based on your last newsletter, I ended up interviewing Sarah Flounders and had a great show on the truth behind the Hong Kong protests. Right. And the National Endowment for Democracy, they play a role too in this Ukraine situation.
Yes, of course. It's the NED is the Regime Change Agency for the United States. It's a private nonprofit that's completely funded by the State Department. They have various branches. They have a Republican Institute, a Democratic Institute, a Chamber of Commerce Institute, and a Labor Institute. So AFL-CIO gets its share, Chamber of Commerce gets its, the Democrats and Republicans, and all they do is they work together on regime change. And so if NED is involved, you have to expect there's a U.S. plan behind it. And and we have an article on Hong Kong, several articles on Hong Kong that talk about that as well. This is another thing that people can't accept. Wow, these people are protesting in Hong Kong. And there's this prejudice against China in the United States. It's deep. It goes back 150 years. The first anti-immigration laws were against Chinese people, Chinese immigrants. So we have a very deep prejudice against China. We've been stoking it recently because the U.S. now is in the midst of a great power conflict, national security strategy. And so Hong Kong is a tool in that great power conflict. And people don't want to believe that. They want to believe these protests are amazing. But in fact, where do they get the American flags from? Where do they get these beautifully printed U.S. signs? Where do they get the gas masks? I mean, this is a very well-funded protest movement in Hong Kong. We're getting off track here.
Yeah, but I want to get back to Giuliani because we want to go back to the Ukraine. Talk about when Giuliani got involved going over there at the behest of Trump, and what was his involvement and how far did he get?
Good question. And what we know so far, and as I said, this is unraveling now, so we have to wait and see. But the current news is that he got involved last December in lobbying and pressuring people in Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden and Hunter Biden, and to dig up, as people say, dirt on one of Trump's main political opponents. And he was there in December. He was lobbying. He was talking to prosecutors, former prosecutors. And he got the story that there was an investigation going on against the gas company that Hunter Biden was on the board of, and it was ongoing, and that's when Biden stepped in, and it kept on developing, and there were pressures from Poroshenko. OU was pressuring the prosecutor to wrap up the case, wrap up the charges. He kept resisting, and at the time he was fired. The news is now saying everyone wanted him fired, but we don't see that in the evidence of the work we were doing covering this Ukraine from 2013 on. And so this is like a new angle to the story. And the Shokin, the prosecutor, put out an affidavit in another case where he described that no one was calling for his resignation. There were no complaints about his performance until Biden came in, and Poroshenko told him, Biden wants you out. We're not getting our IMF loan as long as you're there, so you have to leave. And so that's what Giuliani was investigating, was all that. Now, he was making progress, and then there's an election, and Zelensky knocks out Poroshenko. OU, our man, and our Ukraine insider is gone. This new guy, a comedian, who is a guy who had never run for office before. He had a fantastic TV show you can watch on Netflix, by the way. It's a TV show about 20 episodes where he's battling corruption in Ukraine. This is 3 years ago the TV show came out. But anyway, Zelensky gets elected with a wide, gigantic, overwhelming landslide victory. And then because the parliament was not performing as he hoped, he called for elections in the parliament as the Ukraine constitution allows. They have snap elections in July. And in that election, Zelensky's party wins. And so Zelensky now controls the parliament and the presidency. And poor Giuliani has been working since December, and now it's July, and everyone he's lobbied is gone. And so that's when Trump steps in. And so a week after the parliamentary election, Trump has a telephone conversation with Zelensky. And in that conversation, he talks about all the aid that they give and how he got Europe to give more. And then he asks, can you do me a favor? Kind of tied to the aid, and that we'll see. We have not yet seen an actual transcript of the call. All we have seen so far is the White House summary. So no doubt there's some omissions, there's some spin, and I think that we hopefully will see the actual transcript of the telephone call to get a better sense of what statement about aid was connected to do me a favor and investigate Biden. He mentioned Biden a half dozen times in the phone call, and that's what's led to this impeachment inquiry.
In your wonderful newsletter, you said that this weekend, Mykola Azarov, Ukraine's former prime minister from 2010 to 2014,
yes,
said in an interview that Ukraine must investigate whether Hunter Biden's role in Burisma complied with the country's laws, i.e. investigate what Biden had done for Burisma to justify his remuneration. Furthermore, he said that allegations that Joe Biden had gotten Ukraine's prosecutor general fired to protect his son must also be investigated. So you
That's
write that, but
Yep.
meanwhile, yesterday, the LA Times just posted an article saying that the former Ukraine prosecutor, Lutsenko, said he uncovered no evidence of wrongdoing by either Biden. So can you comment on that discrepancy?
Well, I mean, I didn't know that Biden was even investigated by Ukraine yet. So I guess they didn't uncover anything because they didn't investigate him, Biden yet. So, and Biden was never the focus of the investigation that was going on with the gas. The gas company was the focus. Just the fact that Hunter was on the board made Joe Biden nervous, but it wasn't Hunter Biden being investigated or Joe Biden being investigated. It was the gas company. So that's kind of a tricky use of language there by the former prosecutor in Ukraine, saying we uncovered no violations of law by either Joe Biden or Hunter Biden. Well, that's because they weren't investigated. We don't know yet. Now, the former prime minister who served as prime minister before the coup and who now is in Russia, lives in Russia, he did an interview this weekend where he called for an investigation of the Bidens, both whether Hunter Biden was actually working for the immense amount of money that he was receiving, and whether Joe Biden was inappropriate in using the $1 billion IMF loan and other pressure to force the prosecutor general to be fired. So those are investigations that have not yet happened, and he was calling for those investigations. Now, what kind of power this former prime minister has, I think he has a voice, and Zelensky is interesting. Zelensky, ran on an anti-corruption candidate. His TV show called Servant of the People, which you can watch on Netflix. It's a very funny show. He's a school teacher who has a rant against the corruption in Ukraine. A student captures it on video, and he becomes president. So this teacher becomes president, and it's all about his conflicts in Ukraine, trying to deal with corruption. There's even the IMF, there's the United States, there's the oligarchs are great. Oh my God. It's a worthwhile show to watch. It's a fun show to watch, especially now that he's president. So Zelensky has an anti-corruption as candidacy. So what he'll do with this remains to be seen. If he decides, and he can control who the next prosecutor is because he controls the legislature as well. So he is pretty much the person who will decide whether or not the investigation in Ukraine goes forward against the Bidens and against the gas company.
So let me just mention one other thing that was in Joe Loria's article, because you talked about the withholding of the IMF stuff. He mentions a couple of other incidents where, back to the real scandal of the United States here and
Yes.
our role, Withholding foreign aid was wielded against nations on the UN Security Council in 1991 when the US sought authorization for the first Gulf War. Yemen had the temerity to vote against it. A member of the US delegation told Yemen's ambassador, "That's the most expensive vote you ever cast." And then the US cut 70 million in foreign aid to Middle East's poorest nation, and Saudi Arabia repatriated about 1 million Yemeni workers. Same thing happened before the second Gulf War in 2003, as revealed by whistleblower Catherine Gunn. She leaked an NSA memo that showed the USA sought help from its British counterpart in signals intelligence to spy on the missions of Security Council members to get leverage over them to influence their vote to authorize the invasion of Iraq. In 2001, the US threatened the end of US military and foreign aid if nations did not conclude bilateral agreements granting immunity to US troops before the International Criminal Court. And more recently, the US used its muscle against Ecuador, dangling a $10 billion IMF loan in exchange for the expulsion of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange from its London embassy.
Joe Lauria did a great job there of describing essentially the U.S. approach to domination, threats and bribes. Threaten them with cutoffs of money, threaten them with regime change, threaten them with military attack, and bribe them with loans and military equipment. And that's the American way. And it's actually a grotesque form of foreign policy. It's a kind of a childish form of diplomacy. Rather than persuasion and discussion and negotiation, it's threatened with economic sanctions, threatened with denial of loans, threatened with military force, and demand your way. And I think that is in our article. You mentioned our newsletter article on popular resistance. We talk about how the Ukraine case shows more about ourselves than about Trump and Biden. Trump and Biden, yes, they were both corrupt. They both abused their power. They both used the threat and bribe approach of the U.S. method of foreign policy, which is wrong, and they really neither one of them should be in politics. But it looks like impeachment will happen in the House. There's no question. They have the votes already. The question really is timing and whether or not the Democrats are able to develop public support. Right now, public is split on impeachment, about 50-50. Some polls show more, some polls show less. But what they really need to get to in order to really hurt Trump with this impeachment is 60+%, 65% support for impeachment. If you get to that level of support, that makes a problem for Republicans. Republicans then who are in swing seats may have to start to think about, well, do I risk my political career for Trump? He's a sinking ship. He's not going to win re-election. He's way low in the polls. So why should I tie myself to a sinking ship? And then you have in the Senate where you have to get the 2/3 majority to convict for impeachment. Basically, the House is the indictment, the impeachment, articles of impeachment, and the Senate is the trial where he either gets convicted or acquitted. We've never had anyone convicted because it's a very high standard, 2/3 support in the Senate, not easy to meet. And with a Republican-controlled Senate, it looks unlikely. But if the Democrats are able to take their time, I'd be a big mistake. If I was the Democrats, I would not rush to impeach. I would build my case.
Well,
yeah, and then you have 22 Republican senators up for re-election in 2020. About 6 to 8 of those are in a risky situation. If you can start to get some of those Republican senators to support impeachment, that does even if impeachment does not result in conviction, it's a bipartisan vote for impeachment, and that does serious damage to Trump. So the Democrats need to take their time, build their case, build public opinion, and put Republicans under a lot of pressure. Otherwise, it's going to be could be a backlash against the Democrats. It'll look like a rushed partisan impeachment in the Democratic House and a acquittal in the Republican Senate. It's a partisan issue. It's not really an issue. And then Trump's base will be angry at that partisanship, and independents who are not sure what's going on could go either way. And Trump, who's at 42% in the polls right now, if that kind of energy goes his way, he could be increasing in support. So, Bill Clinton left the White House with 66% popularity, and he was impeached in the House and acquitted in the Senate. So impeachment does not necessarily mean defeat for Trump. Impeachment could be used to energize his base, energize his financial resources, and confuse independents enough that they don't want to be part of this partisanship that's trying to kick a president out in an election year.
I did 2 shows on impeachment, one with Norman Solomon about 2.5 years ago, right after he started that petition on Ruth's action. And that's also when I bought my Impeach Trump shirt. Now, I know you, because I've known you since the Bush administration. We were wearing our Impeach Bush and Cheney shirts, and we thought they were war criminals. And we also thought that Obama should have done something about them afterwards, and he chose to look forward. And all of these things, all they serve to do, not impeaching when presidents are clearly committing high crimes and misdemeanors, by not impeaching and not prosecuting afterwards, all it does is consolidate more power into the executive branch for the next president to use. And we saw how Obama consolidated his power by not doing anything about the Bush-Cheney regime. And now we see how Trump has consolidated even more power. And I think the problem with a lot of leftists, and I'm seeing this on my Facebook page and on Twitter, is they're very much against impeachment because they think, they worry that it'll do exactly what you said it might do. But I'm a purist about this sort of thing. I think that if somebody has committed high crimes and misdemeanors, you have to hold them accountable. And whether there's a chance to be convicted or not, you have to remember that before they started the Nixon impeachment hearings, only 19% of the people were in favor of impeachment. But as this process got underway, it became a majority, and he resigned before he could be impeached. That's now right. We have, the Hill just reported yesterday that a majority, I forget the number, it might have been 60% of the American public are in favor of going forward with this impeachment inquiry. So we're a lot further along. And we also know that Trump has committed far more crimes than either Nixon or Clinton, both of whom were impeached. Now, I haven't studied the Andrew Johnson impeachment, so I can't really speak to that, but I've been following Trump very closely, as have you. And I also posted the other day a very short, it's maybe about 6-minute interview with Bruce Fein, who is a conservative constitutional lawyer who advised on the Clinton administration. And he thinks Trump should be impeached, but he thinks he should be impeached on 14 articles, not just this one. Okay, my second show on impeachment was last week. I had David Swanson on.
He's a big impeachment guy.
Well, yes, but his article said for the first time in my life, and he told me he's been in favor of impeaching every president from Reagan on. Yeah. He said for the first time in his life, he's not in favor of impeachment because he's worried the way the Nadler hearings were going, and not even talking about this new thing with the Ukraine. I got to ask him if his feelings have changed. But the way the Nadler hearings were going, it was going to be more Russiagate, which of course was disproved by the Mueller report. But Nancy Pelosi now is saying that it has to be a narrow, it has to be quick, it has to be narrow. And I agree, we have to take our time. And as far as the objection that, we're not going to be able to do anything for the American people, I think that's bullshit, because you can walk and chew gum at the same time. All the other committees can have hearings on immigration or healthcare or whatever. We know for the same reason that the Senate isn't going to convict, the Senate is also not going to pass any of this positive legislation for the American people, assuming the House even put forward any. So my question to you is, do you think that the inquiry should be broad or be very narrow just on this Ukrainian thing, where in my mind, when I listen to the phone call, I don't hear a real quid pro quo going down right there.
You haven't heard the call. You've just seen the White House.
Right. Well, because they didn't audio tape.
That's right. We don't. But you haven't seen it written. Even though there is a transcript, we haven't seen that either.
I think it should be broad or narrow.
Well, I'll tell you. I think impeachment is very tricky, and I think they have to do it right. And so I would let the Intelligence Committee focus on the narrow issue of Ukraine Gate. I wouldn't stop Nadler from pursuing. He already said he was doing impeachment investigation and process before the Ukraine thing came up. Let him go do his thing, see what he develops. And I would also make sure that the House passed a lot of positive legislation on marijuana legalization, on improved Medicare for all, on raising minimum wage, on taxing the wealthy. Just pass a lot of stuff. Even though the Senate's not going to pass it, put your agenda out there. And so put a positive climate agenda, deal with all the crises that the country is facing. So you can't be accused of a do-nothing House. Have your other committees working hard on all that. And that doesn't mean give in to Trump on the NATO NAFTA too, which has a very problematic trade agreement. I wouldn't give in on that, but I would put my agenda forward. I'm not a Democrat or Republican, as you know. I gave up to Democrats in the early 90s and never looked back. And I gave the Republicans when I was in high school. That's a long time ago. So I was in New York Republicans, Rockefeller, Jacob Javits, John Lindsay, these progressive Republicans that don't exist any longer. But
you were when you were young?
That was high school.
Ooh, you and Hillary Clinton and Elizabeth Warren.
Yeah, well, I don't think that those kind of Republicans existed in Oklahoma where Elizabeth Warren was. Yeah. But Jacob Javits was the first to introduce marijuana decriminalization. John Lindsay, the mayor, was endorsed by the Progressive Party. So there were unusual Republicans. Rockefeller I wasn't that thrilled about, but and the Democrats I gave up during Clinton, when Clinton outflanked the Republicans on the drug war by putting a general in charge of a health problem, General Barry McCaffrey, in charge of it as the drug czar. He lost me on that. He lost me on NAFTA. He lost me on financial deregulation. So many issues. Clinton was
media deregulation.
Media deregulation, taking away poverty programs. So much.
He passed all these proposals that Republicans only could dream about but could never get passed. Similarly, he was working on cutting entitlements at the time of the Lewinsky scandal. If it weren't for that, his impeachment hearing, he probably would have cut Social Security and Medicare too. And we know Obama was working on that with his Simpson-Bowles Commission.
Exactly. That's right. That made Paul Ryan famous. So anyway, it's there's so many problems with the Democrats. I'm not a Democrat or Republican, so my advice, take it or leave it. If I was Democrats, I'd be pushing my agenda quickly in the House, positive legislation on all sorts of fronts to show what the party stands for, show that you're not a corporate party, even though we know it's a lie because they know the Republicans won't pass it, they can pass anything. And I would be also letting the Nadler's committee, the Judiciary Committee, pursue impeachment where he wants to take that path, and have the Intelligence Committee focus on Ukraine Gate. And I would do Ukraine Gate slowly. I would build it up, just like you mentioned, with Nixon. Start with very low support for impeachment and ended up becoming so big that Nixon couldn't ignore it. He knew he was going to lose. I don't think we're there yet. That poll talks about an inquiry, but support for impeachment is still well below 50%. So Democrats have ways to go to build public opinion up. I would be, over the next couple of months, I'd be doing mostly non-public things. I'd be building my case, gathering documents, leaking documents once a week or so to keep the interest up. And then in January, I'd start public hearings. The complainant, the person who filed the complaint, the CIA official who filed the complaint, mentioned 6 people in the White House who the CIA official talked to for the information, mentioned Bob Barr, mentioned the Secretary of State Pompeo, Rudolph Giuliani. That's already up to 6, 7, 8, 9 witnesses. And then I'm sure as you investigate, you'll find more. And so I'd be having witnesses. I would try to shoot for the articles of impeachment to be done around June. The political conventions begin in July. Democrats, August for the Republicans. Greens are in July as well. And I would, for the first part of the year, spend my time building up the case for impeachment and building up public opinion for it, so that when it got to June, you're at 65% support for impeachment. Not just for an inquiry, but for impeachment. And then you have all these 22 Republicans running for the Senate, 6 or 8 of them in difficult situations, a bunch of swing district Democrats running in the House. They're all very nervous when public opinion gets that high, 65+%. They're now all nervous. And so you suddenly you'll start to see you're already starting to see some people in the Republican Party kind of weaselly about impeachment.
Well, 2 people just resigned in the last couple of days. One person announced that he's not running for election, and the other one, who was being investigated for something, I can't remember what, also resigned. So these Republicans
New York and Texas. That's right, two different places. And if you do that right, not only does impeachment go up, but also popularity of Trump goes down. Nixon's popularity got down into the 20s. You know, when impeachment was rising. Trump's already at 42%. You get him down to 32%, and then Republicans are saying this guy is a sinking ship. We need to get off. Then their whole Republican equation could change. Then they could say, "Oh, this is our opportunity. Let's get rid of Trump, replace him at the convention with somebody else, so we have a chance of surviving." And you may even get an impeachment of Trump. Who knows? So if the Democrats make the mistake of what some of them are advocating, which is rush to impeachment, don't even hold hearings, we have the votes now, let's just vote on it and do it, has the opposite effect. It looks totally partisan. The public's not educated about it. No political power is built up. And you'll have a totally Democrat impeachment, Republican opposition, totally partisan divide. It'll be a meaningless impeachment, and it'll actually help Trump rather than hurt him. So
right. So now let me ask you about the select committee, because the select committee on Watergate was where I really got my political education. I remember
a lot of people did. A lot of people did.
In high school, I
watched. Oh my God, that was so fun to watch.
Yeah, I loved watching that. I mean,
Howard
of course,
Baker.
we didn't have the internet back then, so there wasn't a lot of competition for our attention, and all the networks were covering it. But you talk about building up public opinion. With Nancy Pelosi doing what she's suggesting, which is have 5 different committees investigating these various aspects of it, and C-SPAN, you know, not covering these committees, and people not watching C-SPAN anyway. Do you think that at some point it needs to be consolidated into one select committee like we had during Watergate, and that the networks should be televising that? Would that happen at the time when they actually start the impeachment process? Is that what
I hadn't thought about that. That makes a lot of sense. Let these 5 committees go through the investigatory phase, gather documents, gather other information, have private testimony behind closed doors and public testimony in front of for the public to see. And then when you've kind of got all that information together and you're ready to really go forward on impeachment, maybe then create a super committee to focus on impeachment that brings these various committees together. That's a very interesting idea. And you do that in May. And then for 2 months, May and June, you really have that super impeachment committee, bring all this together. And public opinion will be attentive. And it'll be at a critical time. We'll have had a bunch of primaries, and you'll see Democrats will have solidified around the top 2 or 3 candidates. The others will drop, so you have some clear spokespeople in the Democratic Party running for office. And so I think that's an interesting strategy. I hadn't thought about that.
Yes. You and I should go and have a meeting with Pelosi. I think she'd be very interested to hear our.
I'm sure Pelosi will listen to me. Last time I was in Pelosi's office, I was almost arrested. So I don't know.
Okay.
I was doing a sit-in or something. So I don't know.
We already see that Trump is throwing Pence under the bus. Saturday Night Live even did a funny skit on that. Because one of the things that I've been hearing for 2.5 years now is we can't impeach Trump because we're going to get Pence and he's worse. And in some ways, he really is worse. Do you think that Pence should be tied up in this impeachment? Or do you think even if he isn't tied up, we shouldn't care about getting Pence?
Well, I think if Pence were to replace Trump as president, he wouldn't have Trump's baggage, but he'd have Pence's baggage. And Pence's baggage is pretty heavy. He's evangelical right wing who won't go in a room with a woman by himself. I mean, he's so extreme on so many issues. He's not very charismatic. I think he'd be easier to beat than Trump. So if Pence is the replacement for the Republicans, that doesn't solve their presidential problem. So I don't think. I do think, however, that we shouldn't be closed our eyes to Pence's involvement. I'm sure Pence was involved in discussions with Trump about all of this, and that needs to be explored as part of the impeachment process. You have the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, the President, the Vice President, Treasury Secretary, all could be involved in this. I mean, they're all tied into this stuff. So I would be shooting very high for not just Trump, but a variety, but of course, a primary focus on Trump.
Now, what about violence? Another reason people are objecting to this is they're afraid that it's going to inflame Trump's base and there's going to be violence in the street. Chris Hedges even wrote an article about this past weekend in
Yeah.
Truthdig. Do you think that's a danger?
You know, that would be certainly something unprecedented or not precedented for, you know, Civil War was certainly violent, and there had been, you know, there has been violence in U.S. politics in various times, so it's not out of the question. And Trump seems to be starting to try to stoke that, as do some of his supporters. My sense is that that is part of Trump's insecurity. The fact that he's already talking about civil war and violence, to me, shows that he's feeling very vulnerable and that he has to use everything he has to try to silence this process. And so you cannot let the threat of violence stop you. I mean, it's just, if we start to allow the threat of violence to stop pursuit of justice, that's a serious problem. And so I think you reduce the threat of violence if your hearing is in fact open to looking at the Democrats' role in Ukraine, and particularly Biden's role in Ukraine. Now, if the Democrats take the approach of shutting out any discussion of Hunter Biden or Joe Biden's role in Ukraine, then I think that Trump supporters will be more angry, because it'll be obviously a very orchestrated process, and orchestrated against Republicans and not for the facts, all the facts. And so there is a Biden gate part of this, and that should be part of the investigation. The Democrats should not shy away from that. And I think many Democrats already know from Biden's performance in the early debates that he would probably lose to Trump anyway. He's a very weak candidate. He's done very poorly in debates. He has a horrible history on almost every major issue in the 45 years he's been in Congress and in the president's in the White House. He has a horrible history on the drug war, on racist enforcement, on mass incarceration, on student debt.
Well, okay, I think my viewers know how horrible.
How
Biden
bad.
is.
And so get rid of him. The Democrats shouldn't be afraid of allowing that Biden gate stuff out as part of this investigation. That would show that they are actually not as partisan as some of Trump's supporters would like to believe.
Well, we only have a minute left, so I want to wrap up with you talking about what you guys did a week ago today, where you shut down DC.
Well, I was actually in New York for the People's Mobilization against the U.S. war machine to save the planet and stop U.S. wars. And I participated in the climate strike on that Friday. In Washington, D.C., they did a beautiful job. They had 24 affinity groups all organizing on their own to block down key intersections. It's a great model for people to learn from. And they very colorful, artistic blockades that created great social media images, and they successfully shut down DC. And they did the same again later that week on Friday. They came together to shut down some key streets again. I think that's a model that people should try to learn from. And it's just, and at the same time that's going on, by the way, these climate strike events that were going on last week all around the world, 4 million people marched on the first day of the climate strike, the largest global march since the Iraq war protests. In addition, while that was going on, people in the United States and around the world were shutting down coal plants, shutting down fracking efforts, shutting down pipeline efforts. So that while that protest got a lot of attention, there's been an ongoing long-term effort of shutting down infrastructure being built for oil and gas in the United States, around the world, and shutting down coal plants. And so this movement for climate justice to confront the chaos of climate change is really gelling. And so I think that climate strike week was a really great example of it. And I'm sure we'll be building on that and making the climate issue one that can't be ignored. So far, we don't really have any candidate running on an excellent climate plan. The best one in the Democrat Party is Bernie Sanders. The best one of any candidate is Howie Hawkins of the Green Party. Go to howiehawkins.us and look at the eco-socialist Green New Deal. He just put out last week a detailed plan that's based on science, that talks about how much it's going to cost, where the money is going to come from, how we're going to pay for it, what sectors of the economy have to change, the economic bill of rights. It's just an incredibly thorough plan. People should examine that, and that should be the green standard by which every Green New Deal is compared. Because Howie Hawkins is a longtime activist, been arrested for climate change issues, and has put forward this he was the first candidate to ever run on the New Deal in 2010.
Right.
But now he's put forward an incredible eco-socialist Green New Deal that is the right approach based on science and what the planet and people need.
Well, I'm going to be having Howie Hawkins on my show. So I want to thank you for being on the show, Kevin. As always, you're a wealth of information. And I hope people learn that the real Ukraine scandal is not the everyday corruption of Hunter Biden, Joe Biden, or Trump trying to cover it up. It's the long history of U.S. being involved in regime change wars, the imperialist, colonialist background of us trying to bend the will of these countries for our American business interests. And it's really disgusting.
It's disgusting. And I really want people to know that there's going to be a lot of misinformation and to be very skeptical about what you read. Now, with Popular Resistance, I mentioned at the beginning of the show, popularresistance.org/tag/Ukraine. You can follow the whole Ukraine story from December 2013 up to the present time as it happened. So they can't rewrite history. The Biden team is out in force trying to protect Biden's political future, which really is likely to end because of Ukraine Gate, which will evolve into Biden Gate.
Well, he's imploding anyway, because the man is clearly undergoing cognitive decline, and they can't keep him from, these debates. They've kept him from public appearances. He doesn't really do any rallies or public speaking events at all. But in these debates, it's becoming clearer and clearer that he's in the beginning stages of senility. And it's really sad to me that his wife is, not bringing him back. We could talk more about the presidential race, but we have run out of time. So I just want to refer to people to popularresistance.org and to please sign up for the weekly newsletter, because it's certainly where I get a lot of my information. Like my show, The Robust Opposition, Popular Resistance focuses on opposition and resistance to, the corporate state and all its manifestations.
Yeah, I hope someday we'll cross paths in the real world, not just the virtual world. So.
Oh yeah, no, I'm definitely going to come see you soon. I want to hang out with you and Medea. I love the way you guys disrupt stuff in DC. It's a lot of fun. She's sort of a mentor of mine.
That's the spirit.
Yeah. Anyway, so I'm not sure when my next show is going to be or what the topic is. You'll just have to follow me on Facebook and also on Twitter at Lauren_Steiner. And you can subscribe to my YouTube channel. So until I see you next, Kevin and I are going to keep fighting.